It wasn't the headline or the handshake. It was a single sentence followed by 3 calm words that made the room fall dead silent. In the heart of Geneva, during a global summit watched by millions, former US President Donald Trump leaned back in his chair and uttered, "We helped you." The words hung in the air like a verdict. But across the aisle, Ibrahim Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, with the quiet strength of a continent behind him, he replied with a calm so sharp it cut deeper than fury. In that moment, power met restraint, ego met dignity, and the world saw a young African leader challenge an old order not with anger, but with presence. What were those 3 words that left even seasoned diplomats stunned? And could it be that true leadership isn't about speaking louder, but knowing exactly when to speak? The Geneva International Conference Center had never felt this tense. Polished marble reflected the silhouettes of presidents, CEOs, economists, and observers from across the globe. Flags fluttered under soft, filtered light. The occasion was the Global Development Forum, a gathering meant to reimagine the world's economic future, but beneath the formal smiles, an old tension quietly brewed. On one side of the Grand Round Table sat the titans of global capital, the G7 leaders, flanked by executives from trillion-dollar tech firms and energy conglomerates. Towering screens flashed buzzwords like inclusive growth, resilient supply chains, and sustainable cooperation. But most people in the room knew the script hadn't changed in decades. Then came 2 figures who didn't fit the mold. Donald J. Trump, former US president, arrived with theatrical precision. A motorcade of black SUVs, Secret Service agents in dark glasses, and a small army of press followed. His entrance was announced with an echoing formality. To Trump, development aid was business, a transaction. We help, and you owe. His talking points followed the logic of capital. If the West invested in Africa, it deserved loyalty and leverage. Across the room, quietly taking his seat without any televised fanfare, was Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. At just 36, he was younger than almost every leader present. He wore a simple military uniform, pressed but unadorned. No entourage, no gold-trimmed suit. He arrived early, listened carefully, and wrote in a notebook while others polished their speeches. While Trump represented an empire of past dominance, Traoré carried the voice of a continent awakening not with hostility, but with clarity. He didn't need spectacle. His very presence challenged the assumptions of the room. This was the paradox of the Geneva summit. It was meant to showcase global cooperation, yet the undercurrent was clear. Aid still came with strings, and those who cut the strings were labeled rebels. As discussions unfolded, Traoré remained largely silent, watching intently. But when Trump took the floor and launched into a narrative of Western generosity, "We've helped your nations for decades. We built schools, sent medicine, provided jobs." The air shifted. Then came the line that would ignite history. "We helped you." Some nodded in agreement. Others froze. Cameras turned. All eyes slowly shifted toward Traoré, who had yet to speak. The tension wasn't theatrical, it was ancestral. The phrase echoed centuries of exploitation, dressed as benevolence. But Traoré didn't respond immediately. He didn't interrupt. He didn't roll his eyes or reach for a microphone. Instead, he let silence fill the room. Long, heavy, deliberate. It wasn't about words, it was about weight. And the weight of history was finally shifting. This wasn't just a contrast in leadership style, it was a moment where two worldviews collided. One clung to influence earned by loans and military bases. The other whispered of sovereignty shaped by sweat, by soil, and by sacrifice. What happens when a young leader enters a room not to ask for help, but to remind the world he never needed permission? And in a world shaped by volume, could it be that the most powerful voice is the one that refuses to shout? Before a single microphone crackled, before a word was spoken, the air inside the Geneva International Conference Center felt like walking into a museum of old power. Every chair, every placement, every glance was a message. The Global Development Forum had been promoted as a celebration of multilateralism and shared responsibility for the future of the developing world. But as the world watched, the architecture of the room whispered something very different. Rows of nameplates gleamed under spotlight. In the central arc sat the strategic voices, G7 heads of state, IMF and World Bank chairs, and CEOs from tech, finance, and energy industries. At the margins, just slightly off camera, were the presidents of developing nations, and among them, placed near the far right end of the U-shaped table, sat Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. No plaque, no translation headset, no aides in suits. It wasn't an accident. It never is. To those unfamiliar with the rituals of global diplomacy, this might seem like logistical happenstance. But every inch of the seating plan is coded an unspoken script that tells you who has influence and who is merely present. The event theme? Responsibility, reform, and the future of aid. It sounded noble. But the language throughout the opening speeches clung to an outdated rhythm: capacity building, institutional frameworks, fiscal discipline, words that echo like classroom lectures, delivered to nations expected to listen, not to lead. Speaker after speaker praised the partnerships, forged over decades. Yet none addressed the unequal architecture of those partnerships. None acknowledged that in many African nations, foreign assistance has too often arrived with strings wrapped in velvet tapering soft, but tightening slowly with time. And so, for the first hour, the room swayed between applause and polite nods, until Traoré's name was called. He didn't rise to speak, not yet. It was simply his turn to comment during the roundtable segment. But as the camera panned to him, young, composed, eyes still, hands folded, you could feel a ripple of curiosity in the air. What would he say? But before his microphone was even activated, the moderator announced a deviation. President Donald Trump has requested to intervene briefly. A familiar figure leaned toward the table. His presence filled the space before he said a word. With the confidence of someone used to being the loudest in the room, Trump spoke without filter. I just want to remind everyone here, especially the young leaders, that the United States has been helping your countries for decades. We built hospitals, roads, energy grids. We even sent troops to protect your borders. So when we talk about reform, let's not forget who's been signing the checks. The words came fast, not as diplomacy but as dominance. No one interrupted. Some shifted uncomfortably. A few world leaders stared down at their notepads. The statement wasn't just directed at Traoré, but everyone like him, those seated on the margins. Trump continued, "We helped you, and sometimes it feels like there's a lack of appreciation. We didn't have to, but we did, and we expect respect." The moment froze. The phrase, "we helped you," hung in the air like a flare bright, undeniable, and deeply revealing. It wasn't just a reminder of foreign aid, it was a claim of ownership. a declaration that gratitude was the debt Africa still owed. Cameras didn't cut. No one reached for the mic. All eyes shifted to the young captain in uniform who still had not said a word. For those watching the live stream, it looked like a calm before nothing. But for those in the room, it felt like the hourglass had turned. Because behind that silence wasn't shock, it was calculation. Traoré hadn't been placed on the edge of the room by mistake, but the irony was sharp. The most peripheral man in the room was now at the center of global attention. What would he do? Would he respond emotionally? Would he cite numbers and historical grievances? Would he defer, as so many before him had? Or would he do something none of them expected? The camera zoomed. The tension rose. Traoré lifted his eyes. He leaned slightly forward, not toward the microphone, but toward history. And in that precise second, the world didn't just listen. It held its breath. Because when power demands applause, and dignity remains silent, who really holds the stage? The forum was meant to be ceremonial, another neatly choreographed performance where the powerful reassured the rest of the world that they cared. But Donald Trump never read from the same script. Standing without warning, interrupting the planned speaker list, adjusted his red tie, leaned slightly forward, and began with a smile too wide to be diplomatic. And then, without hesitation, his voice thundered across the glass-paneled conference room. Let's be honest for once. The United States has funded Africa's roads, Africa's hospitals, Africa's schools. You name it, we paid for it. There were murmurs, a cough, the sound of shuffling papers. The translator booths lit up in a frantic blink as interpreters tried to keep up. Trump wasn't finished. And yet, we get lectures from leaders who wouldn't even be in office if we hadn't supported their countries with billions. That's the problem. No gratitude, just complaints. Some gasped softly. Others leaned back in their seats, unsure whether to step in or stay silent. The presidents of Senegal and Ghana exchanged brief glances. The IMF chair avoided eye contact altogether. Then Trump turned his body deliberately and pointed his hand, palm down, in the direction of the only man in military uniform seated at the far end of the table. Especially the young ones, the ones who wear boots to conferences. They talk like warriors, but they forget who paid for the microphones they're using. It was unmistakable. The jab had a target, Ibrahim Traoré. A president barely in his 30s, a soldier turned head of state, a man whose country had rejected the traditional donor model and dared to say, no, not with rebellion, but with reforms. The camera zoomed in. Traoré sat motionless. He blinked once. No gesture, no change in posture, no show of emotion. Trump pressed on. You say independence. Independence from what? From the very countries that kept your lights on. From the dollars that paid your teachers. You weren't abandoned, you were carried. And maybe it's time to say thank you. A few claps came from the back of the room, more out of habit than agreement. The applause fizzled before it began. But what didn't fizzle was the tension. It rose like a drumbeat beneath the floor. Because for years, African leaders had danced around this tone. They'd responded with polite corrections, with neutral language meant not to offend. But this moment, this direct accusation of ingratitude, felt different. Trump's words weren't just about aid, they were about power. They reframed the entire history of US-Africa relations as a one-way transaction. We helped, you owe us. Yet the problem wasn't just the content, it was the delivery. It was the smirk, the entitlement, the suggestion that dignity could be measured by checkbooks. Still, Traoré said nothing. And that's when people started listening harder. Not to Trump's voice, but to the silence that followed. It wasn't the silence of hesitation, it was the silence of restraint. The kind that doesn't retreat but waits for its moment to strike where it matters. Educationally, this moment reveals a fracture long brewing. The philosophical divide between transactional politics and transformational dignity. In many Western models, aid is framed as charity a favor given. But in much of post-colonial Africa, it's remembered as a structure of control, where funds arrive with invisible contracts and development is permitted but never sovereign. Trump's speech laid that conflict bare. He meant to shame. Instead, he exposed something deeper, a fatigue with condescension, a growing refusal among a new generation of African leadership to play roles written by others. And so, the question left hanging wasn't whether Traoré would defend himself. It was, would he need to? Because sometimes the loudest voices reveal their weakness through volume, and the most powerful response begins with stillness. As Trump returned to his seat, visibly satisfied with what he thought was dominance, the room sat suspended. Eyes turned again to Traoré. Not because he had raised his hand, or stood, or even blinked twice, but because now everyone wanted to know, when arrogance fills the room, will dignity remain seated or rise with purpose? At the heart of the Geneva Forum, beneath the flags of 20 nations and the polished chandeliers of global diplomacy, a moment unfolded that no one had planned for but none would forget. Klaus Müller, the moderator, looked up from his notes, hesitated just slightly, and called out, "President Traoré, your response?" No shuffle, no clearing of the throat. Ibrahim Traoré rose slowly, wearing no tie, no paper in hand, just the green military uniform that had become a symbol across the Sahel. He didn't move toward the microphone. He didn't raise his voice. And still, the entire room leaned in. "You gave us money," he said calmly. "Yes, but each time, something invisible left our hands our ability to choose, to say no, to stand tall. For every school built, there was a policy tied to it. For every road paved, a contract that led back to you. That's not aid, that's rent." A silence fell not empty, but electric. He held up a simple card, Burkina Faso's development plan, and flipped it. On the back was a handwritten line, "We don't want more. We want to own what we already have." Then he looked up again. "Today, I return your gift, and with it, I reclaim what we should never have sold a dignity." Gasps were audible, not from offense, but from the sheer audacity of truth. This wasn't a speech. It was a boundary being redrawn. Traoré continued, "The narrative says we were helped. But what if help that demands silence is just another form of control? What if generosity that punishes independence isn't generous at all?" He gestured toward the young observers seated along the side aisle, students from Nigeria, Haiti, Bangladesh, Cameroon. "They are not statistics. They are not margins in your GDP reports. They are the future asking a single question: do we rise by standing on our feet, or by kneeling with open palms?" Cameras flashed, but even the media held back, afraid to interrupt. Traoré's eyes locked briefly with Donald Trump's, not in anger, not in defiance, but with the calm of someone who no longer needed permission to speak. No nation owes another, free. And then he sat, no applause, just a stillness so deep it felt like history taking a breath. This wasn't diplomacy, it was moral realignment, a reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary act is not to yell but to refuse to bow. So now ask yourself, in a world of declarations and dominance, could it be that the most dangerous truth is the one spoken softly, but without apology? There was no applause, no immediate response, just the humming tension of an international room realizing it had been disarmed not by fire, but by dignity. But Traoré wasn't done. He stood a little straighter, as if anchoring his words deeper this time. Aid, he said, is not charity when it comes with chains. He paused. The phrase wasn't shouted. It landed softly like a stone in still water, and ripples began to spread across the room. His gaze moved calmly from one section of the auditorium to another. You say you helped us, but you rewrote our school books. You dictated the terms of our medicines. You redefined our laws, our elections, even our language. Tell me what is help if it erases our memory of who we were. This was no longer about Burkina Faso. Traoré was speaking into something older, larger, and far more uncomfortable. The quiet in the room was no longer polite, was introspective. From Italian banking executives to Canadian diplomats, from UN observers to CEOs of infrastructure giants, many began shifting in their seats, their once practiced smiles slowly dissolving. He continued, not with anger but with clarity. A road that leads to a school is meaningless, he said, if the curriculum inside tells our children they are second class in their own land. The screen behind him flickered. No visuals, no charts, no dramatic sound cues, just his voice and the weight of a man not asking for sympathy, but returning a mirror. Development without ownership, he added, is decoration. A strong nation is not one that receives it, is one that decides. We are not against cooperation. We are against dependency masked as partnership. His tone was precise, almost surgical. A 35-year-old captain from West Africa was reframing the very language of international aid. No slogans, no scripts, just lived experience, channeled through a voice trained by silence more than microphones. From the back row, a university professor from Belgium who had worked on African loan programs for over a decade whispered, "He's not rejecting aid. He's rejecting how we define it." That line would later be quoted in a dozen editorials. Traoré looked directly at the row where the French delegation sat visibly uncomfortable. He didn't call them out. He didn't need to. His next line did the work. You cannot give with one hand and hold our throat with the other. That is not partnership, it is pressure with a smile. At that moment, the symbolism clicked. In this international forum where every badge bore a flag, every word was pre-cleared by protocol, here stood a man with no script, no translator, and yet no misunderstanding. He wasn't lecturing the West. He was liberating the room from its assumptions. Educationally, this was more than a speech. It was a critique of 70 years of development economics, a challenge to the Bretton Woods frameworks, and a direct question to every policymaker who ever called exploitation stability. Then came the most unexpected thing: murmurs of agreement. Not loud, but real. A delegate from Vietnam nodded slowly. A Latin American minister was seen clapping once under the table. An Ethiopian journalist wiped her eyes and whispered, "Finally, someone said it." Traoré's voice softened further. You want us to be grateful for systems that made us reliable clients. But what if gratitude, when coerced, is just another word for silence? The question didn't need an answer. The weight of it hung in the air, challenging the very premise of the event: global responsibility and the future of international aid. And then, like all the most powerful moments in history, ended without crescendo. He stepped back. No mic drop, no hand wave, just a silent nod to Klaus Müller, the moderator, and Traoré sat. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to, because something more powerful had occurred. People were thinking, not reacting, not defending, just thinking. As cameras zoomed in on the faces of diplomats and moved, some embarrassed, some merely curious, it was clear. This wasn't a speech. It was a reset. And here's the deeper question now echoing through policy circles, youth forums, and editorial boards. If a man from one of the world's poorest nations can walk into the wealthiest room and shift the terms of dignity, what else are we told is impossible, only because no one dared to say it differently? And then, it happened. 3-sentence, quiet, clean, and irreversible. Traoré looked directly ahead, his voice even but anchored in something deeper than politics. "You gave us money," he said, "but you took our dignity." A pause brief, but thunderous in meaning. "Today, I return them both." No one clapped, no one dared to move. The camera slowly panned across the room, faces fixed, jaws slightly parted, hands frozen over tablets and notepads. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. No bravado, no performance. Just a man standing before the machinery of global power, not to ask, not to beg, but to return something unwanted. That moment, those final 3 lines would be replayed across every media outlet, dissected in classrooms, studied in diplomatic circles. You gave us money, but took our dignity. It wasn't accusation. It was liberation. And the silence that followed was not emptiness, it was surrender. The kind of silence that overtakes a room when truth is spoken without need for validation. Donald Trump, usually the first to retort, the first to interrupt, stood still. One hand rested on the table, the other slowly curling into a fist. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in the session, perhaps for the first time in such a setting, he had no comeback. The American delegation looked unsettled. Murmurs ran through the French row. A South African student in the observer's balcony reportedly whispered, That's what real power sounds like." The moderator, Klaus Müller, leaned slightly forward as if to say something but paused, as if knowing, instinctively, that to speak now would only diminish what had just taken place. This wasn't a man winning an argument. It was a people reclaiming their voice. It was history written not in applause, but in stillness. And perhaps that was the most haunting part. There was no need for volume, no demand for applause, no attempt to explain or soften the blow. Just a dignified withdrawal from a bargain the world had grown too comfortable with. In that instant, Traoré wasn't just speaking for Burkina Faso, he became the vessel for every silent state, every leader told to be grateful, every nation taught to smile while swallowing shame. And it left one overwhelming question burning in the minds of everyone in that room. If dignity must be borrowed with strings, is it ever really dignity at all? The room was still absorbing the echo of Traoré's final words when something unexpected happened, not in Geneva, but online. Within 8 minutes, a clip of his speech hit X, formerly Twitter. Within 12, it was reposted by South African journalist Naledi Simango. The caption read simply, "He didn't raise his voice, but the whole world heard him. #I return both." By the time the forum adjourned, that hashtag had crossed 4 million impressions. By evening, it was trending in 22 countries, from Lagos to Sao Paulo, from Jakarta to Oakland. Users didn't just share it, they translated it, subtitled it, and stitched it into their own realities. In Dakar, students projected the speech onto the side of their university building. In Kingston, Jamaica, a reggae artist remixed it into a track called Silent Thunder. Across Nairobi, quotes from the speech appeared handwritten on chalkboards and pinned outside classrooms. But while the public responded with a roar of admiration, Washington responded with panic. That same evening, Trump's senior advisors huddled in a closed-door meeting at a luxury suite near Lake Geneva. CNN's diplomatic correspondent reported that there was no immediate strategy to spin the moment. It was too raw, too real. Privately, some aides admitted the scene undid years of soft diplomacy in under 3 minutes. A senior State Department official, speaking anonymously, described the speech as a rhetorical rupture. He added, "We're used to loud protest, but this was surgical. You can't dismiss a man who doesn't shout, who just quietly gives you your money back." And what did Traoré do? He didn't hold a press conference. He didn't bask in media attention. In fact, he left the building quietly, through the east entrance, flanked by guards, not followed by cameras. Just him, a modest staffer, and a folded document in hand. When asked by a journalist later that evening why he didn't celebrate, Traoré reportedly smiled and said, "You don't celebrate speaking your truth, you carry it, and keep walking." That humility, that refusal to perform victory only, deepened the moment's gravity. While pundits across the globe scrambled to analyze, decode, and reframe his message, millions simply felt it. No filter, no need for explanation. In Berlin, a political theory professor rewrote his lecture to include Traoré's quote under the section titled Post-Colonial Sovereignty. In Accra, a civil society group issued a statement calling it the most honest African sentence spoken on a global stage in this generation. Yet perhaps the most telling sign of all, by the next morning, "Number I return both" had become more than a hashtag. It had become a symbol of a generation unwilling to trade dignity for funding, of a continent no longer apologizing for its voice, of leaders who understand that silence, when rooted in truth, speaks louder than provocation. And in the midst of that digital storm, the man at the center of it all didn't post a thing. No tweet, no video, no speech replay. He let the world process the echo. So what now? If a single sentence, calmly spoken, could ripple from a marble hall in Geneva to street murals in Ghana, what happens next? If a global narrative can shift without weapons, without shouting, just with clarity and conviction, what kind of leadership will define the next chapter? Can silence, backed by truth, become the loudest form of resistance? 2 days after the Geneva summit, Ibrahim Traoré sat down for a brief interview with a Pan-African journalist in a quiet courtyard outside Ouagadougou. There were no teleprompters, no rehearsed lines. Just a man, a recorder, and a moment of truth. When asked whether his speech was meant as a rejection of international cooperation, he paused. Then he answered clear, measured, and deliberate. "We are not against cooperation. We are only against being treated like children." He let the silence settle before continuing. "When we are silent out of fear, we become accomplices, and we have been silent for too long." That single phrase, accomplices in our own silence, hit like a mirror. In classrooms across Africa, it sparked discussions not just about diplomacy, but about identity. In university forums from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, the quote was dissected as both personal reflection and political challenge. Traoré elaborated further. We don't ask to be praised, we ask to be heard. If a child repeats what you teach him, he is obedient. But if a nation repeats only what its donor tells it, it is not sovereign, it is outsourced. His voice was never loud, but the clarity was piercing. He did not speak in anger, but in awakening. He compared aid to a contract where the fine print is never discussed. You help us build schools, he said, but then you choose the language, the curriculum, the values inside. What you build on the outside, you try to control from within. This wasn't a rebellion, it was a diagnosis, a soft-spoken challenge to global power structures that have long mistaken compliance for consensus. And it led to a question that lingered far beyond the interview. If Africa stopped whispering, what truths would the world be forced to hear? It began with silence. Not the silence of indifference, but the kind that follows a lightning strike. After Traoré's final words at the Geneva summit today, I return both a wave of stillness swept across diplomatic circles, newsrooms, and university auditoriums from Abidjan to Amsterdam. But that silence didn't last long. It cracked open a dam that had been holding back years, no, generations of restrained questions. Within 72 hours, Ghana's Ministry of Finance announced an internal audit of all bilateral aid contracts signed since 2000. Kenya followed suit, with a joint parliamentary session demanding that future aid packages include clauses of mutual respect and national dignity. Even in Nigeria, where the political landscape often leans toward pragmatism over principle, opposition parties and youth coalitions started pushing for full renegotiation of debt-backed development projects. But this wasn't just a ripple through governments, it was an uprising of spirit. From Lagos to La Paz, thousands of students, cultural leaders, and thinkers began organizing decentralized events under a single banner, African Dignity Week. The slogan, a phrase that echoed across murals, stages, and smartphone wallpapers, return both. In Cape Town, street poets wove Traoré's words into impromptu performances. In Kinshasa, entire classrooms turned the Geneva speech into debate topics. And in Addis Ababa, a group of graduate students produced a documentary titled Aid or Chains that quickly went viral in 8 languages. But it wasn't just intellectual circles reacting. It was art, it was sound, it was movement. The Nigerian artist Burna Boy, known for fusing Afrobeat with political commentary, released a surprise track titled Return Both. Backed by a minimalist drumline and haunting vocals, the song sampled Traoré's actual voice from the summit. The chorus was simple. They gave money, we gave silence, we return both. Within 24 hours, it topped streaming charts in 19 countries and was played on radio stations from Lusaka to São Paulo. Many began calling it the unofficial anthem of the dignified generation. Even in the diaspora from Washington, D.C. to Paris and Port-au-Prince black communities began organizing teach-ins, screenings, and roundtable talks. A Harvard law professor called Traoré's address the most surgical dismantling of soft power colonialism we've seen in a generation. Meanwhile, a Brazilian journalist described it as a moral recalibration of how the global South negotiates with the North. The real power, however, was in the grassroots mobilization. What began as cultural energy quickly transformed into policy demands. In Dakar, youth-led organizations petitioned the government to include African languages in economic training programs, no longer accepting French-only curricula imported with foreign aid. In Windhoek, Namibia, city councillors passed a resolution barring any future development projects that came with branding requirements from foreign governments. For many, the question had shifted. It was no longer, "Who will help us?" but "Why do we believe we must be helped?" But perhaps the most surprising echo came not from Africa but from Latin America. In Bolivia, where mining towns still suffer the legacy of external exploitation, indigenous leaders referenced Traoré during a national summit, stating, "He spoke for all of us who've had to trade our dignity for survival." In Colombia, student unions cited the speech as a turning point in how they viewed IMF negotiations. Back in Geneva, where it had all started, something peculiar happened. A small plaque was quietly added to the conference room's side wall. It read, "In this room, the price of silence was returned." Traoré himself refused interviews. His press team issued a single statement. The speech was not an event, it was a reminder. And that's precisely what made it so powerful. He did not celebrate, he did not argue, he didn't brand it, tweet it, or monetize it. He simply returned home and resumed working. That, in turn, made the world pause longer. It made people ask questions that had grown dusty from neglect. What does it mean to accept aid that comes with scripts? When does gratitude become dependence? And can silence, once weaponized, become a form of resistance? As one Ghanaian radio host put it, he didn't just speak for Burkina Faso. He whispered what millions have screamed in their hearts but never dared to voice in a room of power. In one final twist of irony, a European aid official, off the record, admitted, "The problem isn't that he refused aid. The problem is that he made us question whether we were offering help or renting control." So, as the video of that Geneva exchange continues to be shared, studied, and sung, another question emerges that may define not just the decade, but an entire era of North-South relations. What happens when the world's so-called bene fisheries begin returning the narrative too? What began as a sharp exchange of words in Geneva soon echoed like a fault line across the geopolitical map. By the end of the week, what some dismissed as a moment of diplomatic tension had become the trigger for the largest reassessment of North-South relations since the end of the Cold War. In Berlin, the German Chancellor convened an emergency cabinet session, not about war, not about economics, but about dignity. At stake, the country's €11.2 billion annual aid package spanning over 47 African and Latin American nations. The press briefing afterward didn't use the word crisis, but the body language said it all. As one reporter from Der Spiegel whispered off-camera, Traoré said it, and now we have to ask ourselves if we've been listener, just assuming. In Paris, the French Foreign Ministry followed suit. A quiet review committee was formed to re-evaluate the philosophical underpinnings of development policy, but internally, the alarm bells were louder. French energy giant Total Energies, which had held contracts across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Gabon, began quietly exiting its agreements. Stocks dipped, legal teams scrambled. Lobbyists, once confident in the permanence of their arrangements, now whispered terms like political volatility and post-aid nationalism. But the void left behind didn't stay empty for long. Enter Beijing. In a move both subtle and strategic, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce released a carefully worded statement. "We are not here to ask nations to rewrite their constitutions. We're here to trade, fairly and respectfully." Across Lusophone Africa, from Angola to Mozambique, that message landed like a warm wind. In an economic forum in Nairobi, a Kenyan entrepreneur stood up and said, They treat us like adults. That's all we've been asking for. No fanfare, no flags, just contractors conversation. Meanwhile, Russia saw opportunity in silence. Without grand declarations, its state-owned development bank accelerated agricultural equipment loans to Senegal and food processing plants in Ethiopia. Again, no conditions on governance models, only clauses on delivery timelines and interest rates. The United States, however, found itself in a position it hadn't faced in decades, being watched, not followed. American policymakers were divided. Some in the State Department pushed to repackage foreign aid under partnership language. Others doubled down, accusing Traoré of populist theatrics. But behind closed doors, even Washington's most seasoned diplomats admitted that the old script was cracking. He didn't break the system, one former ambassador said. He revealed that the system no longer commands belief. And belief once gone is hard to restore. In Brussels, the EU Development Commission postponed 3 summits. In Rome, think tanks began releasing white papers with titles like Post-Hegemonic Assistance and The Fall of Aid as Soft Power. But perhaps the most symbolic moment came not from policy, but from corporate panic. Investment analysts from Barclays, Deutsche Bank, and BNP Paribas all downgraded long-term forecasts on extractive industries in West Africa. Not due to instability, but due to growing unpredictability of political alignment. In simpler terms, Traoré had shifted the center of gravity. What had once been a lopsided tableware aid was offered with a smirk, and received with a nod was now being flipped, slowly but unmistakably. More nations in the global south began sending subtle but firm signals. The era of silent gratitude was over. From the Philippines to Peru, budget ministers and political scientists started discussing something unthinkable just a year ago: exit strategies from dependency. But here's the real twist. This wasn't a rejection of cooperation. It wasn't a retreat into isolationism. What Traoré had sparked was something quieter, deeper, and far more permanent: a recalibration of dignity in diplomacy. No one was burning flags. No embassies were stormed. No ultimatums were issued. Instead, there were closed-door meetings, red-lined contracts, and new terms being drafted not by colonizers, but by collaborators. And in the heart of it all stood a quiet man in a beige military jacket who had spoken not with anger, but with anchored clarity. It wasn't the volume of his words, but the weight they carried. Now, as Western boardrooms whisper and African classrooms awaken, one thing is clear. This was not a rebellion. It was a realignment. One that is no longer centered around what the global North wants to give, but what the global South is willing to accept. And as this new chapter begins, the world faces a question it hasn't asked in over half a century. What does leadership look like when respect not leverages the currency? It didn't take long. Just 48 hours after the Geneva exchange, headlines across America exploded not with outrage, but with uncertainty. And for the first time in a long while, Donald J. Trump wasn't leading the conversation, he was chasing it. Fox News ran a special segment titled The Ungrateful World, defending Trump's words and labeling Traoré's response as post-colonial performance. But instead of containing the fallout, it backfired. Viewers flooded comment sections not with patriotism but with questions. If we helped them, why are they leaving us behind? Is giving with strings still giving? The attempt to spin the moment felt off. Even traditional Republican voices began to shift uncomfortably. Then came Senator Tim Scott. In a CNN roundtable, he broke ranks. Maybe it's time we rethink what American aid means. If it costs us goodwill, maybe it's not generosity, it's leverage, and people feel it. It was a quiet, bold fracture that signaled the beginning of something larger than politics. A generational rift, a moral recalibration, a reckoning. Across the aisle, young progressives like Rep. Maxwell Frost and Cori Bush seized the opportunity to call for a Dignity Diplomacy Act, advocating for foreign aid policy that includes recipient nation audits not of their loyalty, but of our motives. College campuses lit up with panels and podcasts. Benevolence or bargain? Who truly owns aid? And the viral hit, Return Both, Why Gen Z Doesn't Want to Be the Empire's Face. But perhaps the most telling moment happened not on Capitol Hill but at a high school debate in Atlanta. A 17-year-old girl, quoting Traoré verbatim, said, "They gave us money but took our dignity. Today, I return both." The auditorium fell silent, judges put down their pens, and on TikTok, the clip gained 3.2 million views in 36 hours. It wasn't just the content, it was the clarity, the courage to challenge the very framework of American exceptionalism from within its own house. Conservative strategists, once comfortable invoking foreign aid as soft power, were now scrambling. Internal memos leaked from GOP think tanks showed concern. The Africa narrative is shifting. We are no longer seen as benefactors, but brokers. Even within MAGA circles, the debate turned inward. Some doubled down. Others whispered what they couldn't yet say aloud. What if Traoré's right? And all the while, the man at the center of it, President Ibrahim Traoré, remained quiet. No retweets, no declarations, no victory laps. Just the echo of 3 simple sentences. You gave us money. You took our dignity. Today, I return both. That echo now reverberates not through borders, but through belief systems. Is America ready to give without controlling? Or must its helping hand always hold a leash? What kind of nation do we choose to be when the world begins asking for respect instead of rescue? It began with a sentence. Not a threat, not a decree, just a return. You gave us money. You took our dignity. Today, I return both. That single phrase didn't just echo in the conference hall. It detonated in lecture theaters, think tanks, and coffee shops from Johannesburg to Boston. The world wasn't witnessing a rebellion, it was awakening to a revision. At Harvard, a guest seminar titled Development Without Chains reached full capacity within hours. At Oxford, the Said Business School launched a workshop on ethical aid exit strategies. In Nairobi, professors scrapped an entire semester's syllabus, rewriting it under the banner, Build with us, not for us. This wasn't just a shift in academia, it was a rebalancing of narrative. Meanwhile, across African capitals, entrepreneurs stopped asking for handout sand, started crafting ecosystems. In Kumasi, a startup transformed cassava waste into biodegradable packaging exported to Europe, priced in Cedi. In Dakar, 3 university dropouts launched an off-grid coding school, powered entirely by wind and willpower. In Burkina Faso, Traoré's own team created Burkinabè Sovereign Investment Initiative, prioritizing indigenous talent over foreign credentials. The new currency, trust in ourselves. Investors abroad were startled. They expected noise. They found movement. Total Energies paused expansion. Silicon Valley asked to observe. But none could deny what they saw, a continent recalibrating its compass not toward resentment, but toward renewal. And in the most unexpected corners of the West, minds began to shift. At UCLA, students held a teach-in titled Gratitude Without Submission. At a middle school in Atlanta, a social studies teacher posed this to her class. If you accept a gift that makes you feel small, is it still a gift? A 13-year-old girl raised her hand. Only if you're allowed to give something back. That moment captures the storm. Traoré unleashed not one of protest, but of perspective. Back home, new economies were forming, not based on extraction, but regeneration. Not on GDP rankings, but the quiet rise of self-sufficiency. Across Africa, a new term emerged: sovereign startups, businesses that didn't just aim for profit, but for pride. And the West? It watched. It rephrased its pitch. Because for the first time, Africa wasn't listening to offers. It was offering terms. Now, as Traoré prepares to address the UN General Assembly, schools are watching, investors are listening, and youth from Accra to Oakland are asking, what does dignity look like when it's no longer borrowed but built? The hall was quiet, but it wasn't silence, it was anticipation, pulled taut like a drum. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped up to the marble podium of the United Nations General Assembly, the world wasn't sure what he would say, but they knew it wouldn't sound like anyone else. No teleprompter, no elaborate entourage, just his voice, calm but resolute. We are not against cooperation, he began. We are against relationships where one side gives and the other stays silent, grateful, forever in debt. There was no arrogance, no defiance, just clarity, the kind that doesn't need to shout to shake the room. His words were measured, but the message hit hard. Partnerships built on imbalance and no partnerships at all. Traoré didn't call out any country. He didn't name names. He didn't need to. Instead, he painted a vision of an Africa not asking for favors, but offering co-creation. An Africa not seeking pity, but seeking parity. The room shifted. Delegates leaned forward. Translators paused. And when he said, "True aid uplifts, but aid that silences turns into control. Dignity is not a request. It is a foundation." Something remarkable happened. It started slowly first, with Burkina Faso's neighboring allies, then Ghana, then Brazil, then Indonesia, then Chile, then Vietnam. In less than 10 seconds, the entire southern hemisphere stood up. Applause exploded through the hall, and for 5 full minutes it didn't stop. Even representatives from Europe, visibly conflicted, found themselves clapping, not for political gain, but because the truth had pierced the performance. In that moment, it wasn't about Africa, it was about all nations that had felt small at someone else's table. The cameras panned to observers wiping tears. The headlines would read, "A speech that rewrote the balance." But for those in the room, it was something more. A reminder that history can be bent not by force, but by voice. And as Traoré quietly stepped down, not smiling, not waving, just walking, one question lingered in the air, unresolved. If dignity can speak this powerfully, what else have we been silencing for too long? What happened in Geneva was not just a diplomatic exchange, it was a constitutional break in the narrative of global dependence. Traoré didn't deliver a speech. He delivered an indictment of conditional aid, of systemic silence, of power structures masquerading as generosity. And yet, It was not bitterness that spoke, it was clarity, wrapped in calm, built on a foundation of self-worth. His final words, simple but seismic, continue to echo far beyond that hall. When dignity confronts power, who really shapes the world? Geneva is no longer a media moment. It is a historical inflection point, one that demands each of us as citizens, educators, and thinkers to decide what kind of world we are willing to accept. So now, we leave you with this. Will you watch this end, or will you share the beginning of something greater? Artie, save this video. Share it. Comment your thoughts below. The world is listening.